Adaeze screamed a name into the rain, and she didn't even know whose name it was until it was already out of her mouth. Blood pooled dark against wet concrete. A body lay motionless between her and the man who'd hunted her family for 10 years. Somewhere behind her, Tae-jun was shouting for someone to call for help, his voice cracking apart with a fear Adaeze had never heard from him before. And somewhere inside her chest, a decade of careful control finally shattered completely, because the person on that warehouse floor wasn't the enemy she planned to destroy. It was someone she loved, and she didn't know, in that exact moment, if she'd just lost him forever. Welcome to Afro-Soul Connect. On today's episode, you'd get a dose of culture clash, forbidden love, family pressure, second chances, and an unforgettable reunion. If this is your first time here, make sure to like, subscribe, and click the notification icon so you never miss a new story when it drops. And don't forget to send this story to a friend or family member you think would love it. Also, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I'd really love to know. Now let's dive back into this amazing story. The gunshot had come from Adaeze's own weapon. She hadn't meant to pull the trigger. Not really. Her finger moved on instinct, some animal part of her brain deciding faster than her conscious mind ever could. The moment she saw one of the syndicate's men lunge toward Tae-jun with a blade catching the warehouse light, she fired without thinking. The bullet found its mark in the attacker's shoulder, and the man went down screaming, dropping the knife with a clatter that echoed through the enormous empty space. But that single gunshot detonated everything. The remaining men, 5, maybe 6, positioned in the shadows along the warehouse walls, moved as one, and suddenly the quiet standoff between two families collapsed into full chaos. Gunfire cracked through the rain, shattering off metal crates, sparking against pipes overhead. Adaeze dropped low on instinct, dragging Tae-jun down with her, her ears ringing, every second stretching into its own separate eternity. She saw Seo-jun move, actually move, faster than a man his size should have been able to, shoving Tae-jun sideways out of the direct line of a bullet meant for him. The bullet found Seo-jun instead. He staggered, one hand flying to his side, and for a horrible half-second he simply looked confused, like his body hadn't caught up to what had happened yet. Then the pain arrived all at once, and he dropped to one knee, blood already blooming dark and fast through the fabric of his shirt. And still, he pulled his own weapon from his jacket and fired back into the shadows, buying seconds, buying the only thing that mattered now, time for the people he loved to get out alive. Get her out of here! Seo-jun shouted at Tae-jun, his voice strained with pain but still commanding, still every inch the man who'd run an empire for a decade. Now, go! Not without you, Tae-jun shouted back, already moving toward his brother, but two of the security men who'd followed Adaeze into the warehouse reached Seo-jun first, holding him upright between them, half carrying him toward the far exit as gunfire continued to crack around them like the sky itself had come apart. Tae-jun grabbed Adaeze's arm, pulling her toward the side exit, and for one terrible moment she resisted, twisting back toward the chaos, toward the old man who was barking orders in a language she didn't recognize, his composure finally cracking under the reality that his ambush had failed to go according to plan. She caught a final glimpse of Seo-jun being dragged through the smoke, blood streaking the concrete behind him, his eyes finding hers for one suspended second before Tae-jun physically pulled her the rest of the way through the door and into the rain. The parking lot outside was chaos of a different kind. Headlights, shouting, someone's phone already pressed to the area screaming an address into it. Adaeze's whole body was shaking so violently she could barely stand, adrenaline draining out of her all at once and leaving something colder and more terrified behind it. Adaeze was already there, having followed the chaos with two of the household's remaining loyal guards, her face white with terror the moment she saw the blood on both Tae-jun's shirt and Adaeze's hands. "Where's Seo-jun?" she demanded, gripping Adaeze's shoulder so hard it would leave marks. "Where is my husband? Adaeze, where is he?" Nobody had an answer that didn't sound like a death sentence. They found him 100 meters away, propped against the side of a car, unconscious and losing blood fast, the two security men pressing whatever cloth they could find against the wound in a desperate attempt to slow what wouldn't stop. Adaeze dropped to her knees beside him, sobbing his name, pressing her own hands over the wound like sheer will alone could hold the blood inside his body. "Stay with me," she begged, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the rain. "Please, please stay with me. You don't get to leave me now. Not after everything." The ambulance arrived 4 minutes later, though it felt like 40. Paramedics worked with brutal efficiency, cutting away fabric, calling numbers back and forth to each other in clipped, urgent tones that told Adaeze everything she needed to know about how serious this actually was. She stood frozen, watching, until Tae-jun's hand found hers and pulled her toward the car that would follow the ambulance to the hospital. The ride felt like the longest 20 minutes of Adaeze's entire life. Adaeze sat pressed against the window, silently sobbing, her hands still stained with her husband's blood. Tae-jun sat rigid beside Adaeze, staring at his own hands like he still couldn't quite process what his brother had just done for him, the brother who'd spent a lifetime treating him like the disposable spare, throwing himself into the path of a bullet without a second's hesitation. "He saved my life," Tae-jun said quietly, almost to himself. "After everything between us. After I called him every name I could think of for what he did to you. He still saved my life without thinking twice." Adaeze reached for his hand, holding it tightly, unable to offer him anything else in that moment except the simple, wordless comfort of not being alone in the fear crushing all three of them at once. The hospital waiting room was lit too bright, the kind of fluorescent white that made everyone inside it look like a ghost of themselves. Coffee went cold in paper cups nobody drank. Adaeze paced a track into the linoleum, unable to sit still, unable to stop replaying the sight of her husband's blood on her own hands. Tae-jun sat with his head in his hands, guilt radiating off him like heat, murmuring apologies to no one and everyone at once. And Adaeze sat very still in the corner, replaying the old man's words on a loop she couldn't switch off. Debts don't end with death. They pass to whoever's left standing to pay them. Her father had never told her about any debt. 10 years, and she'd built her entire identity around a story that suddenly felt incomplete. A father who was a victim, and only a victim, of the Kang family's ruthless business practices. But the syndicate's presence in that warehouse meant something else entirely. It meant her father had secrets he took to his grave, and it meant those secrets were still very much alive, circling both his daughters like something that had never stopped hunting. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and dialed a number she hadn't called in years, an old family friend still living in Lagos, someone who'd known her father before Adaeze was even born. It rang 4 times before a groggy, confused voice picked up. "Adaeze, do you know what time it is here?" "I need to ask you something," Adaeze said, her voice barely holding steady. "About my father. About a man named Chief Osei. Please tell me if that name means anything to you." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Too long, the kind of silence that answers a question before words ever do. "Where are you?" the voice finally said, low and careful. "And who's with you right now? Because that is not a conversation we should be having over the phone." The line went dead before Adaeze could ask anything else, and something cold settled permanently into her stomach. Whatever her father had hidden, it was bigger and more dangerous than she'd let herself imagine even after everything that had already happened. The surgeon finally emerged just past midnight, mask pulled down, exhaustion written across his face, and for one horrible second nobody in that waiting room breathed at all. "His stable," the surgeon said, and the entire room exhaled at once, Adaeze nearly collapsing into the nearest chair with the force of her relief. The bullet missed anything vital by less than a centimeter. Another few millimeters and would be having a very different conversation. His lucky. Whoever pushed him out of the direct line of fire probably saved his life, and whoever got him here as fast as they did probably saved it a second time. Adaeze's knees nearly buckled with relief, and Tae-jun caught her before she hit the floor, holding her while she sobbed against his shoulder, months of tension finally breaking loose all at once. Adaeze, standing slightly apart from the family that had somehow, impossibly, become hers over the last several months, felt the full weight of everything settle onto her shoulders at once. Because Seo-jun surviving didn't answer the biggest question of the night. Who was the old man? what her father really owed him, and how far the Osei syndicate was willing to go to collect on a debt that had outlived the man who created it. She didn't know yet that the answers would take her back to Lagos, back to a version of her father's story she'd never been told, and back into a danger that made everything she'd survived so far look like only the opening chapter. Seo-jun woke up 2 days later to find his wife asleep in the chair beside his hospital bed, still wearing the same clothes from the night of the shooting, her hand curled loosely around his, dark circles carved beneath her eyes from 2 nights of refusing to leave his side. He watched her for a long moment before saying anything, taking in the exhaustion etched into her face, the mascara smudged from crying she probably thought no one saw, the way even in sleep her body stayed angled protectively toward him, as if she could shield him from a bullet that had already come and gone. Something in his chest, hardened over years of controlling every variable in his life, softened in a way he didn't quite know how to name. "You didn't have to stay," he said, his voice rough from disuse, and Adaeze's eyes snapped open instantly, like some part of her had been listening for his voice even asleep. For a second, relief flooded her face so completely that she nearly laughed through tears. "You almost died," she said. "Of course I stayed. Do you have any idea what these last 2 days have felt like? I have barely eaten. I have barely slept. I sat in that chair convinced that if I closed my eyes for too long, something inside your body would decide to give up." "I took a bullet for my brother," Seo-jun said, testing the words like they belonged to someone else. 10 years, and I don't think I've ever done a single selfless thing in my entire life. Every decision I've ever made has been calculated, weighed, measured against some cost-benefit analysis running constantly in my head. And then I did that, pushed Taijin out of the way, without even thinking about it. "Maybe that's who you actually are," Adaeze said quietly. "Underneath everything you built to survive this family, underneath the empire, and the control, and the years of pretending softness was a weakness you couldn't afford. Maybe you just forgot." Seo-jun turned his head toward the window, watching the gray Seoul morning press against the glass, and for the first time since the story began, he let himself sit inside a silence that wasn't calculated, wasn't strategic, wasn't performing anything for anyone. Just a man, in a hospital bed, reckoning with the life he'd built and the people it had cost him. "My father used to say weakness gets you killed in this business," he said finally. He said it so many times I stopped questioning whether it was true. I built this entire life around never being weak, never needing anyone, and somewhere along the way, I think I convinced myself that meant never letting anyone need me either. I controlled you because I thought that was the same thing as protecting you. I see now those aren't the same thing at all." Adaeze's breath caught. In 6 years of marriage, she had never once heard her husband speak this openly, this honestly, about the architecture of fear that had built the walls between them. "Say that again," she whispered. "I need to know I actually heard that correctly." "I was wrong," Seo-jun said, meeting her eyes directly, "about what protecting you was supposed to look like. I'm sorry it took a bullet to make me understand that." Adaeze leaned forward and kissed him, gently, careful of the 4 lines in the bandages, and something between them shifted permanently in that hospital room, not fixed all at once, not erased in a single conversation, but genuinely, finally, beginning. Down the hallway, Adaeze and Taijin sat together in the small waiting area outside the recovery ward, closer than they'd been since the night everything fell apart. The danger of the warehouse had done something neither of them expected. It had stripped away the anger, the betrayal, the careful distance they'd both been maintaining, and left only the truth underneath it. He'd almost lost her. She'd almost lost him. And suddenly 10 years of secrets felt smaller than the fact that they were both still breathing. "I keep thinking about what he said," Adaeze admitted, staring at her hands, still faintly stained around the nail beds from blood she'd scrubbed at for 2 days straight. "The old man. About my father owing a debt. I've spent 10 years believing I knew exactly who my father was. A good man, destroyed by people who wanted what he built. I built my entire identity, my entire plan for revenge, around that story. What if that's not the whole story? What if I don't even know who I've been avenging this whole time?" Tae-jun reached for her hand, threading his fingers through haze with a gentleness that made her chest ache. "Then we find out the rest of it," he said simply. "Together. Whatever it is. However ugly it turns out to be." "You don't have to do that," Adaeze said. "After everything I put you through, the lies, the plan, watching your brother almost die because of a war I brought into this family." "I love you," Tae-jun said, cutting her off, the words landing with a quiet certainty that stole the breath from her lungs. "I've spent the last few weeks trying to convince myself I didn't. Trying to protect myself from you, from ever being that vulnerable again. And then I watched a bullet nearly take you away from me permanently. Watched my own brother nearly die trying to keep both of us safe, and none of my careful protecting myself logic mattered anymore. I don't care how our story started, Adaeze. I care about finishing it with you." She kissed him then, right there in a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and fear, months of hate and distance dissolving into something that felt, for the first time since the warehouse, like hope instead of survival. It was Adana. 4 days later, once Seo-jun was stable enough to be left in the care of the hospital staff for a few hours, who found the feist real thread to pull. Cleaning out a storage unit that had belonged to their mother, one Adaeze hadn't even known existed, hidden under maiden name their mother used only for private matters, discovered only because a lawyer finally tracked the sisters down about an overdue payment. Adana dug through boxes of old clothes and broken furniture until her fingers closed around a small metal lockbox buried beneath yellowed documents and photographs neither of them had ever seen. Inside, wrapped in a cloth that had once been white, were letters. Dozens of them, spanning almost 15 years, written in their father's hand, addressed to a man named Chief Kobina Osei. Adaeze's hand shook as she read the first one, dated nearly 2 decades earlier, the ink faded but still legible. "Chief Osei, the shipment arrived safely. Payment has been transferred as agreed. I understand the terms of our arrangement, and I am grateful for the opportunity your family has extended mine. I will not forget what this means for my daughter's future. EO." The letters told a story Adaeze had never once considered. Her father hadn't built his shipping empire alone, out of nothing, through pure grit and determination the way she'd always believed, the way she'd told herself for 10 years while building an entire identity around his memory. He'd built it with capital from the Osei syndicate, dirty money, laundered through legitimate shipping contracts, a partnership that had made both families wealthy for years before something changed. Later letters grew tense, then desperate, the handwriting increasingly rushed, increasingly strained. "Chief Osei, I did not agree to these new terms. The percentage you're requesting now would bankrupt every legitimate contract I've built. I have spent years making this business look clean, and I need it to stay that way, for my daughter's sake if nothing else. Then, later still, Chief Osei, I cannot continue this arrangement. I have daughters now, twins. I want a life for them that isn't built on what we've done. I am asking, one final time, to be released from our agreement, whatever it costs." And finally, the last letter in the box, dated only months before the Kang family's business dispute that supposedly destroyed him. "Chief Osei, you know I cannot honor the clause you're referencing. My daughters are not property to be promised into a marriage before they are old enough to speak for themselves. I will find another way to satisfy this debt. Give me time." Adaeze sat on the floor of the storage unit, letters scattered around her, and felt the entire foundation of her identity crack open. The Kang family hadn't destroyed her father out of nowhere, in an act of pure, unprovoked cruelty the way she'd believed for a decade. They'd moved in on a business already destabilized by a debt he'd been desperately trying to escape, a debt that, according to the final letter, involved some kind of marriage clause he'd refused to honor and that he never successfully repaid before his death, which meant the Osei syndicate hadn't just been circling because of old business. They'd been waiting 10 years to finish collecting on something far more personal than money. "We have to tell Seo-jun and Tae-jun," Adana said, gathering the letters with trembling hands, her voice shaking. "And we have to figure out exactly what this clause means, because if the man in that warehouse is willing to send armed men after 2 women in Seoul over a debt this old, I don't think a simple apology is going to make this go away." I don't think money is even what he actually wants. That evening, gathered around Seo Jun's hospital bed with the letters spread across the blanket, the four of them read through the correspondence together in a heavy, disbelieving silence. Seo Jun, still pale, still weak, read the final letter twice before setting it down. A marriage clause, he said slowly. Written when you were infants. That's not a business debt. That's an old-world arrangement, the kind that used to bind families together for generations before anyone thought to ask the people involved what they actually wanted. He wants one of us, Adaeze said, the realization landing like a stone in her stomach. That's what this has always been about. Not money. Us. Tae-jun's jaw tightened, his hand finding Adaeze on top of the blanket, gripping it like he could physically shield her from a threat 2 decades in the making. Then we make sure he never gets anywhere near either of you again, he said. Whatever it takes. If you're feeling that tension climbing right now, you're exactly where this story wants you. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think Emeka Okoye was a victim caught in an impossible situation he never should have entered? Or do you think some of what happened to this family he brought on himself the moment he took that first payment? I want to know where you land before the truth gets even more complicated. It took 3 weeks for Seo Jun to recover enough strength to travel. 3 weeks Adaeze spent both grateful for the delay and terrified of what it was buying the syndicate. Time to prepare, time to plan a second move now that the first one had failed. During those 3 weeks, something else began forming beneath the surface of the family's fear. Something Adaeze almost missed entirely because she was so focused on the threat outside the house. A quiet suspicion, first raised by one of Seo Jun's own security chiefs, that the warehouse ambush couldn't have happened the way it did without inside information. Somebody inside the Kang organization had known the timing, the location, details that should have been impossible for an outside syndicate to access without help. I've trusted the same 6 men with my life for a decade, Seo Jun said one evening, sitting up in bed for the first time without wincing, going through security logs with a focus that told Adaeze his old instincts were returning fast. One of them fed the Ose's information. I don't know which one yet, but I intend to find out before we go anywhere near Lagos. The suspicion hung over the household like a second storm cloud, one nobody could see but everyone felt pressing down on every conversation. Adaeze found herself watching the staff differently, cataloguing small details the way she'd trained herself to a decade ago, who lingered too long near open doors, who took phone calls in rooms with the lights off, who seemed just slightly too calm in the aftermath of an attack that should have shaken everyone equally. It was Tae-jun, unexpectedly, who found the answer. Going through his brother's older security files one evening, looking for anything that might explain the timeline of the ambush, he came across a series of encrypted messages routed through a private server nobody in the household should have had access to except one person, Jae-won, the head of household security, a man who'd worked for the Kang family for over 15 years, who'd personally overseen the wedding security the night Adaeze first married into the family. He's been feeding them information for months, Tae-jun said grimly, laying the printed messages in front of his brother. Since before the wedding, Hyung. He knew who Adaeze really was before any of us did. He's the reason the Ose's knew exactly when and where to find her. Seo Jun's expression went cold and still in a way that reminded Adaeze, uncomfortably, of the man she'd first met at that wedding a lifetime ago, the man capable of the ruthlessness that had destroyed her father. Bring him to me, he said quietly. Now. The confrontation that followed was brief, and brutal in its own quiet way, not violence, but the particular devastation of watching a trusted man's carefully constructed loyalty collapse into confession under the weight of evidence he couldn't argue with. Jae-won, sweating, refusing to meet anyone's eyes, finally admitted what the messages already proved. Chief Ose had approached him 2 years earlier, long before Adaeze ever appeared in the family's life, offering a payment large enough to secure his daughter's medical treatment abroad, treatment the family couldn't otherwise afford. He'd taken the money. He'd fed information ever since, telling himself each report was small, each betrayal insignificant, until it added up to a bullet in his employer's side. I never wanted anyone to get hurt, Jae-won said, his voice breaking. I told myself it was just information. Just details. I didn't think. You didn't think, Seo-jun said, because thinking would have required admitting what you were actually doing. Get out of my house. You're fortunate I'm too weak right now to decide what else you deserve. The betrayal left a fresh wound in a household already exhausted from grief and fear, but it also confirmed something Adaeze needed to understand before their return to Lagos. Chief Osei was patient, methodical, and had been playing a longer game than any of them originally realized, which meant the confrontation ahead needed to be approached with far more caution than a simple negotiation. Chief Osei's compound sat on the outskirts of Lagos, hidden behind gates that looked ordinary from the road and completely impenetrable up close, guarded by men who watched the approaching cars with the flat, unreadable expressions of professionals who had done this 100 times before. Adaeze hadn't wanted to come back to Lagos at all. Every street corner held a memory of her father, the market where he used to buy her suya after school, laughing at how much hot pepper she insisted on even as a child, the church where they buried him, the old shipping office that had sat empty and rotting for a decade because nobody had the money or the courage to reopen it. Returning felt like reopening a wound she'd spent 10 years trying to close. But Seo-jun, still recovering, weak but stubborn, had made one thing clear before they left Seoul. We end this together, he'd said, gripping Tae-jun's shoulder, then Adaeze, in a gesture that would have been unthinkable from him only months earlier. This family doesn't hide from its debts anymore. Not the ones the Kangs made. Not the ones the Okoyes made. We face this as one family, or we don't survive it at all. The 3 weeks before the meeting had given Adaeze time to reconstruct exactly what her father had owed and why, poring over the letters late into the night with Adana beside her, piecing together a version of Emeka Okoye that was more complicated, more human, and more flawed than the untouchable martyr she'd spent a decade mourning. He'd made a desperate choice as a young man trying to build something out of nothing. He'd tried, for years, to extract himself from the consequences of that choice. And in the end, he died still trying to protect his daughters from a debt he never should have let touch their lives in the first place. Adaeze understood him differently now. Not less. Differently. There was one more discovery buried in the last of the letters, one Adaeze hadn't shared with anyone yet. Not even Tae-jun. A note in her mother's handwriting, tucked behind the final letter, dated the week her parents split the twins apart. I am taking Adaeze and leaving tonight. I cannot let that man's claws touch either of our daughters, and I cannot make you choose between protecting them and protecting the business you built. If you ever find a way out of this arrangement, come find us. If you don't, at least one of our daughters will grow up far from what you've built. I am sorry it has to be this way. Her mother had known, had tried to save at least one daughter from an arrangement she considered obscene, at the cost of splitting her own children apart for over a decade. Adaeze folded the note carefully and tucked it into her jacket pocket, carrying it with her into the compound like armor. Chief Osei received them in a courtyard shaded by an enormous mango tree, seated beneath it like a king holding court, flanked by men who made no effort to hide the weapons beneath their jackets. He looked older in daylight than he had in the warehouse. Silver hair, deep lines carved by decades of quiet, patient ruthlessness. But his eyes, when they landed on Adaeze, held something almost like satisfaction. And beside him, for the first time, sat a younger man, sharp-featured, expensively dressed, watching the visitors with open, undisguised hostility. My son, Kwame, Chief Osei said, by way of introduction. He has been eager to meet you both for quite some time. You look like your mother, the old man continued, turning back to Adaeze. She was clever too, clever enough to disappear with one daughter and leave the other behind, thinking that would protect either of you. It bought you 10 years. I'll give her credit for that much. You have no claim on either of us, Adaeze said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the tremor in her hands, the folded note in her pocket feeling suddenly very heavy. Whatever agreement my father made, it was made without our consent, over our own bodies, before either of us could speak for ourselves. That agreement is not binding. It was never binding, and no court in the world would recognize it as such. Debts of that magnitude do not simply expire because the person who incurred them finds the terms inconvenient decades later, Chief Okoye said calmly. Your father signed in exchange for the capital that built his entire empire. Without my family's investment, there is no shipping company. There are no daughters raised in comfort. There is nothing but a fisherman's son who never rose above the docks he was born on. Kwame leaned forward, addressing Adaeze directly for the first time, something calculating and unpleasant in his expression. My father speaks of debts and arrangements, he said. I'll be plain instead. I've seen photographs of both of you. My father may be interested in old contracts. I am interested in something considerably simpler. The words landed like a slap, and Tae-jun took a step forward before Seo-jun's hand caught his arm, holding him back with a single sharp look that said not yet. You will not speak to her like that again, Seo-jun said, his voice carrying the same commanding authority that had built and controlled an empire for a decade, even weakened by a bullet wound still healing beneath his shirt. Or this conversation ends here, and you can explain to your father exactly why the alliance has been waiting a decade to collect on disappeared because his son couldn't control his own mouth. Something flickered across Chief Okoye's weathered face. Irritation, aimed at his son rather than at Seo-jun. Kwame. Enough. He turned back to the visitors, his expression settling back into careful neutrality. Forgive my son's impatience. He has waited a long time for something he believes belongs to him. Let us discuss, instead, what actually would satisfy this debt. If your heart is racing right now because you can feel this negotiation about to change everything, that's exactly where this story needs you. Comment below and tell me, do you think Seo-jun can actually talk his way out of this, especially with Kwame clearly not willing to simply accept his father's decision, or is this negotiation about to blow up in all of their faces? I want your predictions before we get to what happens next. The negotiation stretched for nearly 3 hours beneath that mango tree, and Adaeze spent every minute of it with her heart lodged somewhere in her throat, aware the entire time of Kwame's eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Seo-jun laid out terms with the same cold precision he'd once used to destroy her father, except this time, Adaeze realized, watching him work, he wasn't destroying anyone. He was building something, a formal business alliance between the Kang shipping interests and select, fully legitimate Okoye trade routes across 3 ports. Access, influence, and profit for Chief Okoye's family, without a single Okoye daughter forced into a marriage neither of them wanted. A debt satisfied not with blood or bodies, but with the one currency men like Chief Okoye actually valued above all else. Expanded power, gained without the mess of false coercion that could unravel into exactly the kind of violent standoff that had already cost him men and drawn unwanted attention in Seoul. You're offering me exactly what I would have gained through marriage, Chief Okoye said slowly, studying Seo-jun with newfound calculation. Without the daughter. I'm offering you something better, Seo-jun said. A marriage can be resented for a lifetime. A profitable alliance rarely is. You get influence without inheriting 2 women who will spend the rest of their lives finding ways to undermine you from the inside. I know my family history well enough to promise you that outcome would not have gone the way you imagined. Kwame stood abruptly, pacing the edge of the courtyard, visibly agitated. Father, you cannot seriously be considering this. We came here for what was promised. A business alliance is not what was written in that agreement 2 decades ago. The agreement was made before either of these women could speak for themselves, Chief Okoye said, an edge entering his voice for the first time, directed at his own son rather than his guests. I am considering something you clearly have not, that forcing an unwilling bride into this family creates a liability, not an asset. I did not build what we have by making decisions with my ego instead of my mind. Kwame, sit down. Kwame didn't sit. He turned instead toward Adaeze, something desperate and entitled twisting across his face. You don't understand what it's like, he said, growing up hearing about the arrangement that would one day give our family the Okoye shipping lines and everything attached to them. I've spent my entire life being told one of you belonged to this family. I won't simply. You will do exactly as your father instructs, Seo-jun cut in, his voice dropping into something dangerous and final, or you will discover exactly how much protection your father's patience has been providing you until this moment. I've been more than reasonable today, given the circumstances. I would not test the limits of that reasonableness if I were you. The courtyard fell into a tense silence, Kwame's jaw working furiously, clearly torn between defiance and the very real recognition that he was outmatched in a negotiation he didn't fully understand. Finally, with visible effort, he sat back down, saying nothing further, though the look he gave Adaeze before doing so left her cold for reasons that had nothing to do with the weather. Chief Osei studied Seo-jun for a long moment, weighing a decade of patience against the offer in front of him. Your father would have simply threatened me, he said finally. You negotiate like a man who's learned something his father never understood. I've had a very educational year, Seo-jun said. The old man was quiet for a long moment, glancing once at his son's barely contained resentment, then back at the 4 visitors sitting across from him with a unified front he clearly hadn't anticipated. Finally, he extended his hand. The debt is satisfied, he said. On the condition this alliance is finalized in writing within the month, and on the condition neither Okoye daughter has any further business with this family ever again. Whatever peace exists between us exists because their story ends here, not because it continues in any capacity. Agreed, Seo-jun said, shaking the offered hand without hesitation. Adaeze felt 10 years of weight lift off her chest so suddenly she nearly staggered from the release of it. Beside her, Adana gripped her hand, both of them holding back tears they'd promised themselves they wouldn't shed in front of this man. But as they rose to leave, Adaeze caught Kwame's eyes one final time, and the look he gave her, sharp and unresolved, told her the peace they'd just secured might be more fragile than his father's words suggested. It wasn't until they were back in the car, pulling away from the compound, that Adaeze finally let herself break down completely, not from grief this time, but from the strange, disorienting relief of a decade-long war finally, actually, ending. It's over, she whispered, staring out the window at a Lagos skyline that suddenly looked different than it had that morning. After everything, it's actually over. Tai-jun pulled her against his chest, pressing a kiss into her hair. It's over, he confirmed. And whatever comes next, we get to choose it for ourselves. No plans, no debts, no families deciding our lives before we're old enough to have a say. What about Kwame? Adaeze asked quietly, the unease still sitting heavy in her stomach. He didn't look like a man who accepts losing gracefully. Then we watch carefully, Seo-jun said from the front seat, his voice measured but alert. A signed agreement doesn't erase a son's resentment overnight. We'll build safeguards into the alliance that protect both families from exactly the kind of impulsive decision he looks capable of making. But tonight, we celebrate what we actually accomplished. The rest, we handle if and when it comes. They stayed in Lagos 3 more days before returning to Seoul, days spent visiting her father's grave together, days spent letting Adana finally see the city her sister grew up in without her, walking the same market streets, standing in the same church, piecing together a shared childhood neither of them had gotten to have. Days spent simply existing as 2 families slowly becoming one, without danger circling every corner of the story for the first time since it began. Back in Seoul, Seo-jun's recovery continued steadily, and something had shifted permanently in him that no amount of empire or control could undo. He started attending Adana's mornings in the garden instead of monitoring them from a distance, sitting quietly beside her with a cup of tea, listening more than he spoke. He started asking questions instead of issuing instructions. It wasn't a complete transformation. Men built the way Seo-jun had been built rarely change entirely, and there were still mornings where old habits surfaced, where he reached for control before remembering to reach for trust instead. But it was real, and it was enough, and Adana found herself falling in love with a version of her husband she'd only ever hoped might exist underneath the control. I almost lost you, she told him one evening, sitting beside him on their bedroom balcony, the city lights spread out below them. And in that fear, I realized something. I wasn't scared of losing the man who controls every part of my life. I was scared of losing the man who threw himself in front of a bullet for his brother without even thinking about it. That man is who I actually married, underneath everything else. I just needed a warehouse and a bullet to remember it. Seo-jun reached for her hand, holding it like something he'd almost lost and refused to take for granted again. Then let me spend the rest of this marriage being that man, he said quietly, instead of the one you were scared of. If this story is hitting you right in the chest right now, let me know in the comments, which transformation surprised you more, Seo-jun learning to let go of control, or Adaeze finally learning the complicated truth about her father? I'd love to know which arc you connected with the most. 2 months of quiet followed, the kind of quiet Adaeze had never once experienced in her adult life, unburdened by plans, revenge, or the constant hum of danger she'd carried since she was 18 years old. She spent those months learning what it meant to simply exist inside a life instead of strategizing her way through one, learning that mornings could be soft, that love could be uncomplicated, that safety wasn't something she had to fight for every single day. It was during those 2 months that Tae-jun proposed again, properly this time, no strategy, no hidden agenda, just a man on one knee in the same garden where Adaeze had spent months confessing her secrets to her sister, holding a ring and a version of honesty their entire relationship had been missing at the start. I know we're already married, he said, laughing nervously despite himself. Legally, at least. But I want to marry the woman I actually know now. Not the one I met at that gallery who was performing a role. This version. The one who told me the truth, even when it cost her everything. Will you marry me again, Adaeze? For real this time? She said yes before he even finished the question, tears streaming down her face, the two of them laughing and crying together in that garden until Adana, watching from the kitchen window, came running out to hug them both. 6 months later, Seoul smelled like cherry blossoms instead of rain. Adaeze stood in front of a small, quiet chapel on the outskirts of the city, her hands steady for the first time in years, wearing a dress that had nothing to do with strategy or survival, just a woman, choosing a life with the man she loved, with nothing hidden between them anymore. Her sister stood beside her as her maid of honor, both of them wearing matching bracelets made from beads their mother used to wear, a small tribute to the woman who'd sacrificed so much trying to protect them both. Tae-jun stood at the altar, watching her walk toward him with an expression that made every person in that small chapel understand exactly what real love looked like, stripped of every lie that had once surrounded it. We're doing this again, he said softly as she reached him, a smile breaking across his face. Properly, this time. Properly, Adaeze agreed, tears gathering in her eyes despite every effort to hold them back. No plans, no revenge, just us. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, and Tae-jun's voice broke halfway through his, unable to finish the sentence about how he'd fallen in love with her twice, once by accident and once completely on purpose, with his eyes wide open to everything about her, the good and the complicated both. Adana sat in the front row beside Seo-jun, her hand resting gently over the small, barely visible curve of her stomach, a secret she and Seo-jun had only just begun sharing with the rest of the family, a new chapter neither of them had expected but both of them had quietly started hoping for since the day the danger finally lifted. Seo-jun watched his brother exchange vows with the woman who'd once been sent to destroy their family, and felt something settle in his chest that he never expected to feel toward the marriage that had once threatened everything he built. Peace. After the ceremony, the four of them stood together on the chapel steps, cherry blossoms drifting through the spring air, for people who had survived betrayal, danger, inherited debts, and a decade of grief to finally arrive somewhere that felt, for the first time in any of their lives, like home. Do you ever think about how differently this could have ended? Adana asked quietly, watching Adaeze and Tae-jun laugh together near the chapel entrance, wrapped up in each other the way people are when they finally stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. Every day, Seo-jun admitted. I think about the warehouse. I think about how close we came to losing everything, to a debt none of us even knew existed. I think about Jaewon, and how easily loyalty can be bought when someone's desperate enough. And I think about how strange it is that the thing that almost destroyed this family ended up being the exact thing that finally brought it together. Maybe that's how it works, Adana said, leaning into him. Maybe some families can't find their way to each other without surviving something first. Later that year, Adaeze stood at her father's grave one final time, this time with her sister beside her instead of a decade of unanswered questions. She placed fresh flowers against the headstone, the same way she had months earlier, but the words she whispered this time carried a different weight entirely. "I found out the truth, Papa," she said softly. "All of it. The letters, the debt, the choice you made when you were young and desperate and trying to build something out of nothing. I understand now why you did what you did, and I forgive you for the parts you never got to explain. You were trying to protect us the only way you knew how, even when it cost you everything, even when it meant Mama had to take one of us and dissipate. I hope you know it worked. In the end, we're safe, we're happy, and we've found each other, exactly like you always wanted, even if it took losing you to get there." Adana knelt beside her, resting a hand against the headstone. "Thank you for giving us to each other, even if it took losing you to finally bring us back together," she whispered. "I have a daughter coming soon, Papa. I'm going to tell her about you. All of it. The good parts and the complicated ones. She deserves to know where she comes from." The two sisters stayed there a long time, in a quiet Lagos cemetery under a sky finally clear of storms, closing a chapter that had defined every single choice either of them had made for over a decade, not with revenge, not with destruction, but with the one thing their father had actually wanted for them all along: peace, family, and love that finally, truly, belonged to them. There's something deeply satisfying about a story that starts in vengeance and ends in healing, about two sisters separated by circumstance who found their way back to each other, and two brothers who learned that real strength was never about control, but about what you're willing to sacrifice for the people you love. Adaeze spent 10 years building a life around a promise made in grief. She finally got to release that promise the day she realized the family she'd built by accident meant more than the revenge she'd planned on purpose. So tell me, do you think Emeka Okoye deserved to be forgiven for the secrets he kept, even though they nearly cost his daughters everything? Do you think Seo Jun truly earned his redemption? Or do you think some men only change when the cost of not changing becomes impossible to ignore? And out of everyone in this story, whose journey moved you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and this story would not be what it is without this community showing up for every twist and turn along the way. If you love this journey from beginning to end, make sure you're subscribed to Afro Connect so you never miss the next story when it drops, and share this one with someone who needs a good cry and an even better ending today. Until next time, stay close, stay open, and I'll see you in the next story.